You're very welcome to this training on respirable crystalline silica. The reality of this training is silica dust can kill, and it's up to each one of us to make sure that we don't become a statistic. I see so many people, and I'm sure you do as well, creating dust clouds while they're cutting, drilling, operating machinery, all of those sort of things. But the materials we're working with, they can contain this deadly mineral silica. So for years now I've been teaching asbestos training, but guess what? This is very similar. This is the new asbestos. The only real difference being back then they didn't know the dangers, and many of them that were exposed aren't with us here today. Just to put it into perspective, I had one lad on training telling his story to them all in the class. He blobs in his eyes telling us he'd an asbestos related disease, and he found it hard to accept that he was on borrowed time. I don't want anyone on this course here today to say the same thing about silica. If someone said there's asbestos in your building, you wouldn't go near it without taking the appropriate precautions. Well, silica is exactly the same. It's a carcinogen. It causes cancer. So we need to treat it with severe caution. I'm guessing that some of you might have a bit of an idea about silica, and after this training you're going to know more so that you can make the right choices. No one wants to develop a work-related disease, no. Like, the effects it has on families is devastating. Sometimes you see lads working in clouds of dust. We've all seen it. Like, let's be honest. We might have even done it ourselves, but we need to think of later life and the effects it can have. Some people haven't a clue of the dangers. So today we're going to look at real life stories, and I hope that it gets the point across. My company slogan is think first, not after, and it's true. We can't go back in time. So the best course of action is to take measures now to protect your health and not be looking back saying, I wish I'd done this, that or the other, because it's going to be too late then. The bit of good news though is if we take simple precautions, it greatly reduces the chance of silica damaging our health. So the next few slides are just a snapshot of the course as we look at respirable crystalline silica so that you can work safely. And if you're interested in the full course, please contact me on the email address on this slide. We're now going to look at the learning objectives. So what you're going to take away from this training. So the first one is to be able to identify silica hazards that might be present in your workplace. So we look at the different types of material, the likes of stone, concrete, engineered stone, etc., and what sort of silica content they have. For example, concrete, that can vary from 25 to 70%. We'll also look at the different control measures that can help reduce silica exposure, such as water suppression or extraction by using an appropriate vacuum. Remember though, the vacuum has to have a HEPA filter and a H-type filter. And H-type filters, they're used for highly hazardous dust. They're the ones that you need to deal with silica because it's classified as a carcinogen. Next, we need to understand the health and safety requirements for working with silica, the exposure levels, and what needs to be done from an employer and employee's point of view. And finally, we look at the steps we need to take to protect ourselves from respirable crystalline silica hazards that are on site. At the end of the day, we're our own health and safety officer, and we need to make the right decisions so silica doesn't affect our health over time. We sometimes think we're indestructible, but that's not the case. Or we don't bother to take simple precautions. Sure, it's only a 5-minute job, it'll be fine. But all the exposures, they add up over time, and it can result in silicosis of the lung, and there's no cure for it. But if we use and follow control measures, they're the things that reduce the risk. We can help ensure that we remain healthy. A little bit of history now on respirable crystalline silica. So silica, it's not a new problem. No, not at all. So it's one of the oldest known occupational health risks, and workers have been dealing with the dangers of silica exposure for hundreds of years at this stage. But back in the 1700s, there was a guy called Dr. Bernardo Ramsini, and he found evidence of silicosis in stonemasons. And he's often referred to as the father of occupational medicine. But he noticed that stonemasons were getting sick from breathing in the dust. What he was seeing back then was actually silicosis, but they didn't have a name for it at that stage. Then in the early 1900s, Dr. Alice Hamilton, she documented silica-related illnesses among granite workers, and she was a pioneer really in occupational health in the United States. So she could see that granite workers were suffering from silica-related illnesses, and her work was really important as it highlighted industrial diseases. Then we have the 1930s, where these granite workers asked their employer for installation of ventilation equipment in their workplace. They were really pushing for a change because they were seeing their friends dying from respiratory illnesses. So they asked their employer, can you please install ventilation in the workshops just to control the dust levels? And it was a turning point and one of the earliest examples of workers demanding dust control for their protection. And this picture here was taken at the time, and you can see the extraction hoses coming down from above. It was a massive thing at the time to have control measures like this in any workplace, as health and safety wasn't a big deal back then. Even though the experts, like we've seen on the previous slide, Dr. Ramsini and Hamilton had shown the dangers of silica, the problem just didn't go away. So workers kept getting sick and dying from silicosis because dust controls weren't widely used and the hazards were often ignored. Some employers weren't bothered, they didn't want to spend the money, and lots of workers, well, they weren't aware until it started affecting their health, and at that stage it was often too late. But one of the worst examples was the Hawks Nest tunnel disaster in West Virginia during the Great Depression of the 1930s. So the project, it was one of the worst industrial disasters ever linked to silica dust. So the tunnel was a sandstone, which has got a silica content of about 70 to 90%. And the workers weren't given any masks or breathing equipment to use while they were carrying out activities. But the management wore them on their visits. So that shows that they knew, but gave no consideration for the worker. And out of the 1,200 men who worked on the tunnel, it's believed that 760 of them developed silicosis and died within just 5 years. So most of them were young men, and their deaths were directly linked to breathing in massive amounts of silica dust while drilling through rock without any protection. The disaster highlighted how deadly silica exposure can be when proper controls aren't in place. We're now going to look at what exactly silica is. So not all silica is the same. So you've got crystalline silica, and that's classified as a class 1 carcinogen. And that means it's known to cause cancer. It's highly hazardous and the health risks are very serious. It causes silicosis, lung cancer, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, COPD for short, and kidney failure. And because it's classified as a carcinogen, employers have a legal obligation to reduce exposure as low as technically possible. And what that means is the employer must use every practical method to minimize the amount of silica dust that workers breathe in. And that's achieved by following the hierarchy of exposure control, such as elimination, substitution, engineering controls, admin, and the last line of defense is always personal protective equipment. Next, we have the second type of silica, and that's non-crystalline. So the non-crystalline silica is much less hazardous, and it's not linked to silicosis, and it's not classified as a carcinogen. It poses minimal risk in the workplace setting, and only lab testing can confirm which form is present in a material. Then we have crystalline silica. So there's three main types of it. So the first one is quartz, which is found in sand, it's found in rocks, granite, bricks, clay, concrete, slate, sandstone, etc. It's everywhere in the construction industry. For example, like the likes of concrete alone can contain up to 70% crystalline silica, depending on the type of aggregate that's used. And sandstone, that's a quartz-rich material, which has a very high silica content of being between 70 to 90%. So it's important you know the materials you're working with. And if you understand the silica content, you can better identify the potential risk of exposure. Then we have cristobalite and tridomite, and they're usually only found in high heat environments, the likes of foundries, ceramic kilns, and glass manufacturing. You wouldn't normally come across them on the likes of a construction site. Next then, just look at the structure of the respirable crystalline silica. So when you look at respirable crystalline silica under a microscope, like what you see here in this picture, it's made up of very small, jagged particles, a bit like tiny shards of glass, really. The problem is these sharp, pointed particles can easily cut and damage the lung tissue when you breathe them in over time. And the repeated cutting causes scarring of the lungs, and that's what they call silicosis. It also increases the risk of lung cancer and other respiratory diseases like COPD. It's really scary. But if we take simple precautions, such as water suppression or extraction, it greatly reduces the risk. Remember, the last line of defense is always personal protective equipment. We're now going to look at the route of entry, which is inhalation, breathing in of the particles of respirable crystalline silica. So respirable crystalline silica, that consists of very small dust particles that are suspended in the air, and the particles, they're so small and tiny that they can travel deep into the lungs when it's inhaled. So if you're working with the material that contains crystalline silica, when that crystalline silica material, when that's fractured or crushed, like when, for example, when you're doing drilling or cutting, it releases a dust cloud, and that's released into the air, and that's what's referred to as respirable crystalline silica. It's extremely fine, roughly about 100 times smaller than a grain of sand, and the fine dust is inhaled into the lungs and then penetrates then deep into the alveoli, which are the little air sacs within the lungs. And respirable crystalline silica is chemically inert, and what that means is that the silica, the respirable crystalline silica, it doesn't react, it just stays in the lungs, causing mechanical and inflammatory damage rather than chemical damage. And if it gets into your lungs, it just sits there and causes fibrosis or scarring of the lungs. So the lungs basically develop scar tissue around the silica dust that causes fibrosis of the lungs. And because respirable crystalline silica is so fine, it's invisible to the naked eye, which makes it really dangerous. So you could be under the illusion that there's not a lot of dust being produced and think that you're not being exposed because you can't see it. But if you were to shine a thing called a Tyndall beam, which is just really a glorified flashlight into the air, you'd see the bits of dust floating around. And it can be suspended in the air for long periods of time. So you might be finished a task, but then you or someone else re-enters the area and then they get exposed as it's still suspended in the air, as it's so fine and practically invisible. Then we're on to the shape of it. So the shape helps cause the damage. Because of its jagged shape of the respirable crystalline silica that we've seen earlier, it can cut and damage the lung when it's breathed in. And then over time, this damage causes scarring of the lungs, and that's what we said is known as silicosis. And it also increases the risk of lung cancer and other serious respiratory diseases. And up next is just a short clip showing exactly what happens when it enters into the lungs.
It's one of the most common substances on Earth. It can be found in materials like sand and rock, and building products like concrete and brick. When a worker cuts, grinds, or drills materials that contain silica, dangerous crystalline silica dust is released into the air. As the worker breathes, Silica crystals flow into his mouth and nose and down the air passages deep into the lungs. The tiny crystals enter the small, fragile air sacs where oxygen is absorbed into the blood. Immune system cells, called macrophages, engulf and try to dissolve the crystals, but they are unable to. Over time, more and more crystals build up inside the macrophage cells. The macrophages carry the silica into the walls of the lung, where they die. Scar tissue forms around the dead cells and spreads as more cells die. This damage can continue even after the exposure to silica stops. Eventually, so much scar tissue forms that the lungs can no longer function.
Thanks for watching this overview, and I hope that you take away the important messages to manage respirable crystalline silica at work. As I said at the start, it's always top priority that you manage health and safety, and that you're your own health and safety officer at the end of the day, and you need to make the right decisions. So this session has covered some of the key points. The full course explores all areas dealing with respirable crystalline silica. Safety First Solutions, we provide courses and a range of other practical training courses designed to meet your needs. And if you found this course interesting, please check out the other courses that I offer. I would really appreciate it if you could like and share the content with others that might benefit. Remember, the key message is learn to do the job safely before you do the job at all, and make sure that you've got the appropriate control measures in place before you start. Thanks very much for your time, and stay safe.